Welcome to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. I am John Gulliver, and I'm here to introduce the seminar series and our speaker. First, sponsors. The seminar series is funded through the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, the Clean Water Legacy Amendment, the Clean Water Council of Minnesota, and supported by the Cold Climate Stormwater Center of Excellence, funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and co-directed by the University of Minnesota and the University of New Hampshire, in partnership with the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance. So that's a mouthful, but the takeaway is we got lots of sponsors. The Minnesota Stormwater Pollution Seminar Series is also a partnership with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and hosted at St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. For those of you online, please use the Q&A function within Zoom to post your questions for our keynote presentation and expert panel discussion. Our speaker today is Lewis Smith. Lewis is an attorney who has been practicing law for 40 years. He's a member of Smith Partners, a law firm devoted to water resources law and public-private partnerships. His firm represents a dozen watershed organizations in the state of Minnesota. Lewis graduated from St. Olaf College with a BA in Political Science and Speech, and from the University of Minnesota Law School. He was a law clerk to the Honorable Gerald W. Heaney, United States Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit. Lewis has taught water law at the University of Minnesota Law School. He is past president of the River Council of Minnesota and past chair of the Minnesota Clean Water Council. They're one of our sponsors. Today, he will be talking about Minnesota watersheds and the Watershed District. So it's my pleasure to welcome Lewis Smith.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Andy, also for this invitation. I feel like I'm an old, long-standing friend of the Water Resources Center and many of your sponsors, so it's an honor to be here. While this may be a keynote, I'm mostly thinking of it as the warm-up act for a fantastic panel that is going to bring us a really great discussion. So my hope in the time I have is to trace for you where the concept of watersheds and watershed districts comes from, get into the Minnesota distillation of those concepts in the Watershed Act that the legislature adopted in 1955, which explores the purposes and powers for which watershed organizations can be created. And then we had a few bumps in the road, and it prompted some more serious look, especially within the Twin Cities metro area, to do more intensive watershed management planning, and I'm going to dive into that a bit. And then I'll conclude with a reflection on some of the tools, but the evolution of watershed districts over time and what some of our challenges and successes have been. And I think that'll cue up a really great panel discussion. So when I start with kind of the basic principles underlying water law and getting us to the concept of watersheds, I start with a precipitation map. You folks know this much better than I, but that 100 meridian line basically is the dividing line between where you average 20 inches or more of rainfall in a year or 20 inches or less. And what's legally relevant about that is the states to the east, which range 20 to 50, 60 inches a year of rainfall, have a legal system dealing with water law, which we call riparian rights. And to the west, it's a different system called a prior appropriation. Riparian rights law to the east, the essential idea is that this is my water to use because I own the land next to it. The idea to the west is this is my water to use because I got here first. Okay? Two powerful, robust concepts for how we should manage water resources. It's my water because I own the property next to it, and it's my water because I got here first. That really describes how our courts dealt with water disputes for easily 100 years or more. Over time, there have been other ideas about the roots of water law. One of them is that it is the sovereign's public waters that are held in the name of the crown for the benefit of the public. And here, as we liberated ourselves from the crown, we still embrace that concept, and it's called the public trust doctrine in our courts now. And it's the basic idea that public waters that are navigable are to be shared in ownership in the name of the public for common use for navigation, commerce, and general commerce. One other idea that we trace much more to indigenous communities, which you still see showing up in the law in various ways all around the world. It's a different way to think about water resources, which is this water is a sacred resource. It is a communal resource. And we living on this earth now have an obligation to care for this resource for future generations. Now, that's quite a bit different than this is my water because I own the property next to it, or this is my water because I got here first. But I think it's an important addition to get us to kind of a healthier perspective in terms of at least legal systems and concepts. Over time, the limitations of some of these concepts led legislatures to adopt state laws and statute to regulate more how these private disputes between property owners or holders of water rights would be regulated with a broader look to the public interest. And it's in that context that we see the concept of watersheds emerging. And I really point to really what I call kind of a father of watershed ideas, and that's John Wesley Powell. Now, John Wesley Powell, we could spend 2 hours just talking about him. He is a fascinating character. I'm sure many of you already know about him. But when he was 22 years old, he set a boat right here by the St. Anthony Falls Lab, or at this site, in 1855. And he traveled in an oarboat, rowing his way down to the Gulf of Mexico. The next year, he did the same thing, traversing the entire Ohio River, getting to the Mississippi and up to St. Louis. And the next year, he did the Illinois River and the Des Moines. Earlier in his life, he had walked across the entire states of Wisconsin and I believe Ohio. That spirit of adventure led him west, and he led several major expeditions to the western United States, really gathering key data and mapping from a Western European perspective on the Western landscape, primarily in the Colorado River, multiple expeditions. He wrote a major report in 1879 that was brought to the United States Senate, and it was called the Report on Arid Lands. And what he introduced in that report was the idea that we should be organizing at least the Western United States around the concept of watersheds. And he defined watersheds as that area of land, a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common water course, and where, as humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become part of a community. So the whole identity of the landscape defined by being within a hydrologic system, a drainage basin, which of itself calls for human beings to be settled into a community. He took that idea and recommended that we have watershed commonwealths to organize, instead of our state boundaries, organize settlement of the West, European settlement, and focus on the natural resources within these major river basins, in which he called attention to the limitations of water and how much could be supported, and what were the most useful economic activities, whether they be animal agriculture, grain growing, a variety of other economic activities, mining. But he called for a vision of sustainability within these basins so that we would not develop more than the environmental basin, the watershed, could sustain. And the United States Senate said, thank you very much, Mr. Powell, for this very, very interesting report. But our friends here with the railroads don't like it so much, and so he was pushed aside. But the idea he introduced was that we would define our governance and manage our resources within these hydrologic basins, that we would see an interdependency of community within these basins, and that they would be largely locally self-governed. Again, the report was dismissed, but it remains to this day very prescient because he called to mind many of the drainage disputes and water rights disputes that we now see in the Southwest United States. And I think many look back to his report with the idea that it might have been a useful approach. If we were to look at the same idea in Minnesota, you would see instead of 87 counties, 87 or so watersheds. And this isn't really fiction anymore because this is the basis which Minnesota now has pursued a program of one watershed, one plan. So we have intensively done watershed planning largely along these lines so that we address water quality and water quantity issues in a local watershed context. So this is one way in which the watershed idea has taken hold in state policy. I think that sets us up then to ask, well, what are watershed districts and where did they come from in Minnesota? And they came largely from my mentor, Raymond Hake, who worked first in the Minnesota Attorney General's office and then later as an attorney for the Isaac Walton League and other organizations focused on conservation. This was a time in the 1950s where you can imagine robust post-World War II development happening in the Twin Cities metro area, but also throughout the state in more urbanized areas. And the focus at this time was to maximize the development in your community so that you grew your tax base and could pay for services that you need in your community. What this also meant was a lot of sudden emergence of automobile habitat. So hard surfaces that sent a lot of water downstream, and this gave rise to a lot of concern of disputes between communities, the downstream community not liking all the water that was sent from the upstream community. This is also a time of intensive drainage of wetlands, and so there were a lot of conservationists pointing to that as they were advocating for the Watershed Act. So it was in this context that the legislature took a pretty bold move because there's no other state in the country that has anything really like watershed districts in Minnesota. And it created a new special purpose unit of government. This unit of government is an overlay over municipalities or townships. It crosses county boundaries as well. It follows the hydrologic boundary of a watershed basin. And it's a special purpose unit of government, meaning it is only existing to manage water resources. And it only exists where people want it, where local government or citizens have petitioned the state to establish a watershed district. And it's gone through enough process for the state to determine there's something viable here to be managed through a watershed district. Its board is governed, each watershed district is governed by independent citizens who do not stand for election, but are appointed by the counties. The county commissioners appoint the watershed managers. They are given, and we'll dive into this a little bit more, some pretty broad authority to regulate land use as it impacts water resources, to finance water resource improvements, and to levy property taxes and special assessments to pay for water projects. This is a suite of quite significant legal authorities for a special purpose unit of government that's just focused on water resources. And so in Minnesota, We have about 47 or so watershed districts. You see that there's a carve out, and I'll describe the metro area more later on. But there's about half of the metro area is organized within a watershed district where local communities petitioned to have them created. And then you see the Red River Valley has a large amount of watershed districts. And this, I think we can tie to a history of flooding and a lot of federally funded public projects that tried to deal with the flooding, but also needing a local vehicle for receiving those federal funds and dealing with local water resources. And so watershed districts were petitioned quite significantly and extensively throughout the Red River Basin. And then you see several other key areas where there is probably a history of flooding and other drainage issues that prompted local communities to petition to have watershed districts created in southern and central Minnesota. So, and I'll say more about the metro watersheds in a bit. But what you see is there's parts of the state that have had no interest historically in having watershed districts. So again, let's go a little deeper into the purposes for which watershed districts are created and a sense of what their authority is. It's important to note that, again, this is a special purpose unit of government, and legally what that means is a watershed district does not have the broad police powers to protect the health and welfare of the community that a municipality does. So it only has the authority that the legislature has given it only to address these water resource issues. There's a very long list in the statute for all the purposes for which a watershed district can be petitioned to be created. It, for me, falls into three buckets. One is the protection of water resources. Another is improvement of water resources. And finally, provision. But again, since it's not a police power entity like cities, it does not have, a watershed district doesn't have authority to deal with zoning, making land use governance decisions, and it cannot regulate surface use like boating and docking issues. That's for other entities. So let me describe these protection resources a little bit more. It largely focused on mitigating the impact from floods, attending to and conserving stream flow, protecting and improving water quality, protecting, managing, improving groundwater resources. In terms of improvements, the early version of the statute spoke of draining areas, but now it's much more focused on restoration of restoring water courses and water basins, basically taking areas that once were drained and streams that were made straight to allow for more efficient use on the margins of the land, and now restoring that sinuosity, the elbows that Mother Nature intended for those streams. And also watershed districts have the authority to take over and manage responsibility for public drainage systems. The watershed districts, this is not widely used authority, but they do have the authority to deal with water supply issues for domestic, industrial, agricultural, recreational, or public use, and also to manage hydroelectric power systems. So I think there's one or two watershed districts in our history that have touched these, but it's not a widely used authority. Also, in 2024, we updated the Watershed Act. The legislature brought it current, and one of the broader purposes it inserted was that watershed districts can otherwise manage and protect surface and groundwaters for any beneficial purpose. So that, again, is very broad authority. There will be other constraints in terms of how it's implemented, but the legislature has, since 1955, very much intended that watershed districts, where they do exist, where people petitioned them into existence, would have very broad authority to protect all aspects of water resources. In terms of legal authority, again, it's a special purpose unit of government, and it can only exercise these purposes and powers to the extent necessary to pursue its lawful conservation, water resource related purposes, and its watershed district's exercise of authority is subject to review both at the state level, in some cases by the Board of Water and Soil Resources, or directly in district court. Watershed districts have kind of the suite of key local government powers that are important for any unit of government. Of course, to sue and be sued, lawyers like that one, but issuing bonded debt is a very significant authority given to watershed districts. And then also the right of eminent domain, or acquiring property either through gift, purchase, or the exercise of eminent domain. So this is, again, a powerful set of tools in the toolbox for a body that is governed by appointed citizens. So something to be mindful of. Watershed districts also are authorized explicitly to enter into construction contracts, and they have inspection authority on the lands within their watershed or even outside of it to make surveys and investigations. They're also authorized to prepare floodplain maps and control land use and development in the floodplain, greenbelt, and open space areas, those water-related areas that have been mapped within a community. And the watershed law also gives metropolitan watershed districts in the 7-county metro area additional authority to regulate the use and development of land, again, as it impacts water resources. And that authority is coordinated through a planning process I'll describe in more detail in a moment. But the key thing to know is that that authority can be delegated or shared and assumed by a municipality through a process of a local plan developed that meets the requirements of the watershed plan. And if a city wants to take over this regulatory authority that the watershed district has, it just needs to adopt its local plan with meeting those same standards. And typically the watershed district and this municipality enter an agreement to share how that process is going to go. So in the late 70s, early 80s, we were starting to see watershed districts get into different kinds of controversies largely about lake restoration projects. And one of the controversies is, if we have a watershed district that has parts of Anoka County, Washington County, and Ramsey County, and we have a project that's going to improve a lake in Anoka County, if I'm a Ramsey County property taxpayer, why am I paying property taxes to help some lake in Anoka County? And that is a dispute that was litigated quite a bit and ultimately resolved in favor of allowing a watershed district to do projects like that and levy across its entire watershed, because that's what the authority the legislature gave it. But that controversy came to the legislature, and this is a photo of Senator Gene Merriam, who represented Anoka County and later became commissioner of the DNR. He was the main author in the Senate of the Metropolitan Surface Water Management Planning Act, which the legislature did enact in 1982. And it was focused on having a process so that watershed, lake improvement or stream, other projects just don't come kind of on a whim, but have gone through some sound planning for cost effectiveness, that it really required that sound planning would lead to a sense of tax equity, that if a watershed district did comprehensive planning for the entire watershed to address all of the needs, then it would be fair to tax all of the property in that watershed to deal with that suite of projects. I should point out that watershed districts also have the authority to go to what you would call a sub-watershed area and assess costs to a more localized area if in the judgment of the board that's more appropriate. But what this envisioned then was a comprehensive watershed approach for the entire 7-county metropolitan area. And what that meant was that the whole seven-county metro area would now be organized in some kind of water management organization, and that there would be a planning requirement that every 10 years, the organization must go through an intensive planning process to identify and inventory all of the water resources and land in the watershed, to name what the problems are to be addressed in that watershed, to plan projects and programs to address those problems and estimate their costs, and to have an implementation plan to show how all of that would be realized. And so your choices were to either have a watershed district, or where there is not one, there must be a joint powers water management organization. A joint powers water management organization is created by agreement, a joint powers agreement between municipalities, or in some cases a county and other entities, in which they would agree to manage these issues and go through this process through that joint powers agreement, rather than have the power being an independent watershed district. And what this set up, I think, is that in every city in the metro area, there is now an inherent kind of relationship established with a watershed organization. And there can be some tension in that relationship where the city is focused very much on its land use planning needs, and it views the watershed district as sometimes antagonistic to achieving its land use goals. That might be one of the reasons why municipalities would come together and say, no, we don't want a watershed district in our area. We'd rather have a joint powers group where we, the cities, manage it, and we establish all of that by agreement, rather than let the county boards appoint independent citizens to have taxing authority and pursue a water resources agenda through a watershed district. So again, the water management organizations are established by a joint powers agreement, and their funding typically does not come through a property tax levy, but it is funded by what they agree to chip in among each of the cities. There's one or two that have gone to the legislature and asked for special authority to pursue their own property tax. And I would say that if you look at the budgets of most of these joint powers organizations, they are kind of slim budgets, because you're limited by the lowest common denominator of the poorest partner. And so in general, if you look at a map of where WMOs or these joint powers entities exist, and where watershed districts exist in the metro area, in general, what you're going to find is watershed districts exist where there are water bodies that have a lot of public interest, landowner interest in protection and restoration. Lake Minnetonka, White Bear Lake, and think of the major streams or other water resources in the metro. That's not universally true, but I think you'll find it kind of lines up that way, where there has been an interest to go through the process of petitioning to create a watershed district. And most of these joint powers, cities, WMOs, do not exercise very active regulatory authority, but simply have some kind of advisory process they might go through, and it varies by organization. So we've had now, since 1955, watershed districts in existence in Minnesota. And if I were to try to characterize what's happened since 1955 in a broad sweep of terms of evolution, most watershed districts in Minnesota were created and established largely because some big flood happened. And the flood crossed municipal boundaries, and it led people to believe that they were only going to solve and manage that flooding problem in the future if they had an entity that could address the watershed, that could cross municipal boundaries and do planning and implement projects that would deal with that flooding over the longer term. And so that's generally the first focus in the evolution or existence of watershed districts. Over time, as those flooding problems start to be managed, attention also turns to water quality. And you all here in this room and online have spent much more time in your careers diving into what that means in terms of designing best practices to deal with the quality of stormwater runoff and how we manage for that. Ultimately getting to a time of having total maximum daily loads and allocating waste load and trying to manage to achieve water quality goals. Along the way also, watershed districts are paying active attention to volume control. So it's not just managing the peak flows of water leaving a site, but also the total volume of water that is in runoff, and promoting practices to retain back as much of stormwater as we can on site to promote infiltration. That's been another interest of watersheds. Some watershed districts, certainly not all, have pursued a land conservation agenda, using their authority to acquire unique natural sites and preserve those areas, conserve or restore them, and have a way to manage and protect water resources through that kind of proactive land conservation practice. And then I would say we're now in an era where best practice for watershed districts is about integrating the work for water resources planning with the plans of the land use authorities and other entities in community, so that we're not doing the water resources work in isolation, but integrating it with sound land use planning for the vision for a community where water resources protection isn't imposed, but it's rather planned through a shared process that creates value together. So that's not perfect evolution, and it's not all been entirely smooth. There have been challenges. And for watershed districts, maybe the first challenge is what I would just call recognition of authority. Not everyone knows what a watershed district is, and once introduced to them, not everyone believes that they should have to get a permit from a watershed district to do their project. So there are landowners that have had to learn about that.
Keep going. You're good.
Okay. I found myself here already. But one of the entities that really challenged watershed districts' authority to permit projects was the Minnesota Department of Transportation. And one example I have is at Camp Coldwater Springs, which is kind of the birthplace of Minnesota. It's where soldiers first came, even before there was Fort Snelling, and this Coldwater Spring provided drinking water. It was before that, and has been for centuries, a sacred site for both Dakota and Anishinaabe people because of its proximity to Bedote, where there's a meeting of the rivers, again, as part of being a sacred space. So this Coldwater Spring is adjacent to the Highway 5562 interchange, which MnDOT needed to reconstruct as a part of the Hiawatha Light Rail project. And how am I doing on time, Andy? Okay, it's worth a story. So the watershed district engineers took a look at the hydrology of this area and the plans that MnDOT have for constructing this interchange. And the watershed engineers said, wait a minute, there's a problem here. If you build this interchange the way you propose, two problems. One, it's going to cut off the groundwater flow to this Coldwater Spring, which has been declared an historic resource. Number two, you're building your interchange below the groundwater table. That doesn't seem like a good idea. So it was hard at first for the MnDOT engineers to accept what the watershed engineers were saying is true, but ultimately that all got sorted out through a lot of litigation. And I believe it is the only case in the history of Minnesota courts where a highway construction project has been halted by a court in the middle of construction to pause and allow environmental issues to be addressed. And in this case, the construction of an amazing liner with 8 layers that is basically a protection basin that allows the interchange to sit on top of this liner and for all the groundwater to flow underneath and around it so that the flow to the springs is protected and the interchange is kept out of the groundwater table. But that interchange wouldn't have been constructed that way but for the Watershed District and their engineers flagging a problem. And so it's an example where the Watershed District invested in people kind of recognizing the authority and that they had a point to make about protecting water resources in the face of land use projects. I've also said before, I think there's this inherent tension when you have an overlay unit of government that's imposed on top of the landscape of traditional municipal boundaries. And so integrating and figuring out how you're going to exercise water resource protection authority alongside the land use authority really requires a lot of collaboration. We'll say more about that in a minute. But that's one of the challenges in this watershed work. Another challenge just comes from how we Minnesotans like to deal with water. This diagram was done about, I think, 10, 12 years ago, and it was drawn from the perspective of a municipality that listed all the different water activities they felt responsible for that had been imposed on them by state or federal law, and all the units of government that they interacted with to fulfill those mandates. So it's not, if you're a city, it's not necessarily a happy diagram. Pardon? And you don't even see watershed districts in this diagram. But the fact of the matter is we have had proposals every governor, every 10 years, someone needs to do a reform of water management in Minnesota, with the argument that at the state level, we have the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, we have the Department of Natural Resources, we have a Board of Water and Soil Resources, and if that's not enough, we also have the Department of Health and Department of Agriculture dealing with water issues too. So why do all those state agencies need to be dealing with water issues? Couldn't it be simplified somehow? And then we have the Metropolitan Council, we have counties involved in groundwater protection, we have all these obligations that municipalities have, and we have watershed organizations. How can we make more sense out of that? And so you're going to see proposals to reform and deal with that on a pretty regular cycle. And my experience with those discussions has been that proposing to eliminate someone, an organization, it encounters a lot of resistance. And usually the improvements that we've made in this process over the years, over the decades, has come more from understanding people's call or their charge within their respective lane. And then how does that charge relate to the responsibilities of others in this diagram? And how can the process work better in a more collaborative way and a shared understanding to achieve better outcomes for everyone? So that's my bias in how to work through these. But our panel is going to get into one of the more recent proposals that has come from the Sensible Land Use Coalition and Paul's group, where the idea is to collapse and basically eliminate watershed district regulation of development and have the cities be the focus for where that happens and watershed districts in an advisory capacity. We'll have a whole hour to talk about the merits of that. But it's just one, I see it as, again, one in a cycle of discussions we're in for here in Minnesota, because we have created a lot of structures to deal with water as a resource. So it's not all been doom and gloom. I think there have been some successes for us to point to. And I think I would say most of the successes come from integrating work through a collaborative approach. So here I have a few examples to talk about. The photograph on the bottom is Methodist Hospital in St. Louis Park, where the Watershed District there went through a whole project to restore Minnehaha Creek to its more sinuous, natural flow that Mother Nature intended, do some wetland restoration in relation to that work, but all envisioned by the hospital as a new amenity for its patients that would, and they created a boardwalk adjacent to it that created a sense of outdoor access to nature in the literature, telling you get to better patient outcomes if you have that kind of proximity to nature. And so the hospital had a lot of different flooding problems, had a lot of different ways it wanted to proceed to expand its campus. Ultimately, in partnering with the Watershed District, they were able to get to a shared investment that brought them not only meeting all of the regulatory standards, but the hospital is much, much happier with the environment around them because of that partnership approach. West End, also in St. Louis Park, at that 394 Highway 100 interchange, a major first wave of development that happened there by a fluke. A conversation started with the developer in the Watershed District about what permitting requirements would be. And that discussion led to how the requirements could be exceeded with just a bit more investment. And it led to so much improvement in water quality that downstream Brownie Lake was no longer listed in the impaired waters list. So the pollution that had been coming from that area was reduced so much that now that lake met state water quality standards. And again, a shared investment approach where the developer met kind of established standards, but partnering with the Watershed District figured out how to exceed those standards and create a story that West End Development likes to tell about their contribution to water quality and water resources. And then the top two examples are Locust Hills and Woodland Cove, which are projects that I think Paul had some history with, and were a story of, again, shared labor with the Watershed District and the idea of pursuing a better outcome through early coordination and planning. And both projects, I think at least one, but maybe both, won awards for environmental design. But I don't think those projects are without barnacles and stories to tell, and Paul will help us remember that the process doesn't always work perfectly. But again, they're an example of a private developer in early dialogue with the Watershed District and the municipality trying to plan for the collective best outcome. So as I wrap up, I think my message is that watershed districts are a very unique creation that is a gift in Minnesota from the perspective of locally led watershed management, water conservation, water protection. To have a appointed board that doesn't have to stand for election, but are people appointed based on the merits of their experience and insight, manage a local watershed with the tools and authority to get the job done, is very unique. It's not been without bumps in the road. There have been challenges as everyone sorts out what their respective authority is and how best to work together. But I think in the end, when you are a special purpose unit government, if you are a unique academic institution, your best advice is get out of your silo and find your partners, because that is really going to be the path to collaboration and success, efficient use of resources, and better collective outcomes. So I think that's really hopefully queuing up this all-star panel we have to come up and help us through that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. So do we have any questions from inside the auditorium? Yes, in the back.
Yes, thank you for that summary. It was very enlightening. Can you briefly explain the connection or differences between soil and water conservation districts, which are prominent in many places in the state, and watershed districts and/or watershed management organizations?
Excellent question, and I have some history with this question. First of all, each county in Minnesota has a soil and water conservation district with a couple of metro exceptions where that's been decided to no longer be the way to go. But otherwise, as you look throughout the state, we have county soil and water conservation districts. They were largely created as a vehicle for federal ag funding to promote conservation practices on the landscape. I think their toolbox is uniquely suited to outreach to individual landowners to promote best conservation practices. And they are a key partner in the clean water work for the state. My personal story is that when I was a young buck attorney attending my very first Watershed Association conference, the rumor was that there was a proposal to eliminate watershed districts and have all of their responsibilities passed to the soil and water conservation districts. And that, of course, was a major sin. And so we worked to do battle against that proposal, which never really was much, I don't think it was widely circulated, but that was kind of my baptism into learning about soil and water conservation districts. They were a threat to watershed districts. Over time, especially as chair of the Minnesota Clean Water Council, looking at how you want to achieve clean water goals across the state and use this precious funding that the citizens have given us, you see that you need to have a partnership approach, and soil and water conservation districts are uniquely suited to addressing much of the issues we have at the individual landowner scale. So I'm a big fan of soil and water conservation districts now as a citizen anyway.
Thank you. Do we have a question from online?
Yes. With the increased demand for data centers and the significant amount of water that they consume, do you foresee petitions for new watershed districts?
Excellent question. And I got to tell you, in the last month, I've been a part of half a dozen different conversations in different settings about what the implications of data centers are for water resources. As a lawyer, running around town and around the state representing watershed districts, I would love nothing more than have more watershed districts. But the question really will be what local communities need in terms of evaluating the impacts of data centers on their groundwater and on their water resources. And I don't fully know or understand those impacts. Some of the discussions I've been a part of, there's a lot of big numbers thrown around, and it sounds like it could really threaten groundwater, drinking water supply in some communities. Other places, there's innovative discussion going on about stormwater reuse and water as a cooling resource for a data center in which there could be some kind of collaboration. So I think data centers are a big water issue in Minnesota. We're going to see more of them because of our northern climate. And so the cooling costs are less here than in the southern part of the United States. And they're going to raise water issues that may be dealt with through an environmental impact process or community planning process. But a watershed district would have the authority to comprehensively look at the groundwater issues, surface water impacts. But it takes a while to get a watershed district established, and my guess is the data center decision might be made before then. But thank you for that question.
Okay, great. We have another question from in-house.
Thanks, Louis. I hope this isn't an unfair question, but if you were going to participate in writing new legislation to establish watersheds in other places, think of like adjacent states, you said there aren't any anywhere else. If someone was interested in establishing these watershed districts, would you change a lot about how they were established in Minnesota, going to these new places?
Well, I love that question too. I've started some of these conversations from, different conferences and things, and I would say it'd be really fun to start from scratch. The 1955 understanding of water resources, and how you would create a local unit of government, and the Minnesota context is all pretty context bound. There, I think, some key principles for how watershed districts in Minnesota operate that are going to be good guides for how to adapt to other states. And I think it would vary quite a bit in where in the United States you're talking about, because in the Western United States, you're going to be dealing with water scarcity issues and existing allocation of water rights and how to manage all of that process. Our Minnesota watershed law largely at the time tried to embrace both the riparian rights principles and some prior appropriation principles to kind of weave it all together as best they could. They basically created the biggest suitcase they could think of to carry as many tools as they could think of. So I think this work is very context landscape specific, but a watershed district that is specially charged with focusing on water resources, has a hydrologic boundary of its authority, is some regulatory authority to exercise, and has planning and taxing authority, are really those are the key tools you need in your toolbox. And so I think it can be exported, but it very much needs to be adapted.
Okay, great. Do we have another question from online?
How do watershed districts navigate conflicts with municipalities that have their own development priorities? In practice, who has the final say when a watershed district and a city disagree on a project or regulation?
This is the introduction to our panel.
It is, yeah.
But it's a great question. Who has the final say depends on what the issue is. If the issue is this property going to be developed as a commercial office building or not, Watershed District doesn't have anything to say about that. If the issue is, will this new commercial office building manage stormwater to meet best practices, it's probably going to be the Watershed District's call as to whether that standard is met or not. And there will be examples that we all probably know of where there's competing visions or a lack of communication, or maybe the sad story of a developer working all the way to a full design of a project, talking to just the city, and then discovers she has to get a watershed district permit, and that's a whole new design conversation. That could be expensive and very frustrating. But what we're shooting for instead is a lot of early conversation at the early concept stage, where communities have already done some planning together with the watershed district and really have a sense of what development's coming to them and how it fits with water resource protection goals. And then everyone's working in that posture as partners, trying to figure out how to get the best outcome for everyone. So you're going to hear much more about that, much more eloquently in a little bit. I thought there was a question in the front.
How does groundwater that may cross so you have the watershed districts, and then you have, I thought because Coldwater Spring, actually, I heard at one point that it gets water from right near here, like there's a path underground. So if there's two different watershed districts and there's groundwater aquifers or something that cross, how is that managed?
That's a really excellent question, and the answer is nobody's figured that out yet. The aquifers don't follow the surface watershed boundaries. There's a lot of places of interaction between them, and that's why it's appropriate for watershed districts to pay attention to groundwater. At a local level, I mean, counties might disagree with this, but at a local community level, I don't know who's really charged with and has the resources technically to be stewards of groundwater. And I think we've found out that this might be a little sacrilegious to say, but I think we've learned in Minnesota that the DNR could do a better job of paying attention to groundwater appropriation. And I think they are trying to. But so we have groundwater issues coming at us in terms of quantity and quality that I would argue nobody's really on top of. The Met Council tries to be on top of it. The DNR, local communities, counties. But so to me, it is appropriate that watershed districts have authority to deal with groundwater, but they are not going to be the definitive entity for aquifer protection. So not a very satisfying answer for you, but I think that's the point I heard in your question, which is the aquifers don't follow surface watershed boundaries.
Okay, let's thank Louis once again.
All right, welcome back to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. My name is Andy Erickson. I'm super honored and privileged to be able to moderate our panel discussion today. What I will do is introduce each of our panelists and ask for their relation to the topic. And then we're going to turn to you with your questions. So if you're online, please use the Q&A box online in Zoom. If you're in person, just raise your hand. We'll come around and give you the mic. But without further ado, I will introduce our experts who have graciously accepted the invitation to be on the panel today. I'm going to start at the far end of the table, my right, your left, with James Wisker, who is the administrator for the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District. James, from your experience and perspective, how do you relate to the topic today?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Well, like you said, I work for a watershed district, so I do have an opinion on the matter. My perspective, I'd say, is grounded in, I was just talking to Doug, now over 20 years at the intersection of land use and water planning, and through the evolution of work that we've done at the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District, and how our approach to work has changed over time, some of which Louis talked about, the challenges over time. So I tend to think about watershed management through a few core principles that have shaped how our organization operates in the metro. I think number one, and as a transplant here from the UK, one of the things that struck me about Minnesota is water defines us as a state and a region where we are the land of 10,000 lakes. Nature underpins our sense of place. It defines our community. We're sitting here on the river in the St. Anthony Falls Lab. So whether it's the river, the chain of lakes, Minnehaha Falls, Lake Minnetonka, which is the headwaters of Minnehaha Creek and our watershed, as I look out, our communities are literally built around and on water as the defining element. So I think that the work of watersheds isn't peripheral, it's the heart of building thriving communities. And because of that, I would say second, watershed issues aren't just environmental issues. They're fundamentally land use issues. So probably folks in the audience know how we use our land determines how water moves, how it's stored, its quality. And so the way that we plan communities and design and build infrastructure and how we coordinate all those decisions, which admittedly is hard, directly shapes the values that we see in the outcomes in natural systems. And that's reflected in the legislation, 103D, that Louis was talking about. It specifically says watersheds conserve the natural resources of our state through land use. And I'd say third, while water is definitely central to community outcomes, we're going to hear a lot about this. It's governed completely separate from land use. You know, watersheds don't own all of the land. We don't control all of the decisions about the land. And conversely, cities don't necessarily think, plan, and manage at a watershed scale. Cities are thinking about development, municipal infrastructure, public safety, maybe not disappointing voters who want to maximize the economic potential of their land. So I would say from the get-go, there's a healthy tension baked in that needs to be navigated and coordinated. And a number of studies have pointed out that water isn't always well integrated into land use. I've seen the Office of the Legislative Auditor, Minnesota Environmental Initiative, Hennepin County Study Water Governance, the PCA, and there's probably a longer list that calls out some of the challenges and outlines a call to action for watersheds to be involved in land use. So there's a structural challenge, two systems, two different authorities. And I would finish by saying it's a recognition of those principles that shaped how we approach our work. And we've developed a philosophy that we call balanced urban ecology. And that's really all about integrating water as early as possible at every scale into how communities are planning for growth rather than doing it separately. And that means shifting from a model where water showing up late as a constraint, impacting timelines and funding, to one where water from the very get-go, like Wesley Powell envisioned in the West, it's informing our decisions from the very beginning. And so that's a little bit about my perspective and my time at Minnehaha Creek and how I think about watersheds.
That's great. Thank you, James. Our next panelist is Cara Geheren, who's a municipal practice leader and principal engineer at Bolton and Menk, but also you serve as the city engineer for the city of Victoria. So, Cara, from your perspective and experience, how do you relate to the topic?
Sure. So happy to be here, sandwiched between these two groups that I have no tension or conflict with ever. So I am a consulting city engineer, and I'm going to focus my comments around my time in the city of Victoria. So I've been working for the city for 25 years, so I've watched the community grow from a population of under 5,000 to 12, 13,000, depending when we're measuring. We're adding new homes every day. So as a city engineer, compared to a water resource engineer, I'm a generalist. And I'm really tasked with balancing the city council's priorities and policies, some of the goals that James was referencing. First and foremost, their number one priority being local control. And then secondly, creating efficient infrastructure that serves the community now and well into the future. Some of that infrastructure is built to last 100 years, so we're making decisions for things that need to serve the community well into the future. But then uniquely with the city of Victoria, it is the city of lakes and parks is their motto. You could also call it the city of lakes and parks and wetlands. We have a lot of natural resources, and it is a point of pride for the community. So protection of those resources is a really important element to how the community views growth. So through the evolution of the 25 years that I've been working there, our relationships have changed over time with the development community and with the Watershed District to try to accomplish all those goals collectively. And I think we've reached a point where we've gotten pretty good at it. So, but it was not without struggle and pain. I'm sure it may come up, but yes, James and I get along very well now, but our organizations had us at opposite sides of a table for a number of years. So yeah, that's what brings me here.
That's wonderful, Cara. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Paul Robinson, who's the Development Director at Rachel Contracting and also a member of the Sensible Land Use Coalition Board. Paul, from your perspective and experience, how do you relate?
I wasn't really prepared to do as long of an intro, but because I do have a lot to say, and I don't know, maybe I should throw it all out right up here. But just as a background, I have a master's in public administration, so I started working for cities. I worked for cities for 9 years. My last city was in Medina, where I was the city administrator. And so I spent a lot of time at the city level, and I understand the sort of concept and the sort of idea of a watershed wanting to control the hydrology and the areas that overlap counties and cities. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, from a planning perspective, that makes a lot of sense. I've been developing now for about 25 years. In my early career of development, I did work on Locust Hills as well as Woodland Cove. And, we spent a lot of time, and I was part of a group that was really wanting to be innovative with how stormwater treatment was completed. And we spent a lot of time, effort, and money. We also really believed on trying to coordinate early and often with the watersheds to create a win-win situation and outcome. I would say what's happened over time, and eventually all this stuff has to get paid for, right? And so what's happened over time is regulation has caught up and exceeded anything that we had in our wildest dreams back when we did Locust Hills. And, at some point, there's no longer any fuel in the tank left to keep paying for more and more items where we don't see a whole lot of benefit necessarily. If you look at the state, 50% of the state is farm fields, and there's no stormwater treatment. The water just runs right off of it. We put a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of money into the metro area, especially into single-family homes and into residential situations where people are going to have to pay for it eventually, and somehow they have to pay for all of this kind of these layers of regulation. And the white paper, and so now I'll switch into the white paper was written by the Sensible Land Use Coalition. Sensible Land Use Coalition has been around for 50 years. Or just a little under 50 years. It started as a way for the public and private sector to collaborate and to talk to each other, especially on land development issues. And I recently just felt we haven't been doing enough to sort of really live into that space. And so we decided to, and if you think of the legislature and where this is kind of swirling around is we have a shortage of housing in the Twin Cities. We have a shortage of housing in America right now. And, and the idea of, I'm not going to call it affordable, attainable housing, but trying to even just deliver housing at a price when people could afford is getting more and more difficult. And it's not Watershed's fault. It's not the wetland regulation fault. But all of these are stacking nickels. All of the totality of these regulations are starting to add up, and they're adding costs. And I think we need to collaborate with each other to work out how can we make it better? How can we achieve the same goals? Kind of what you were talking about. How can we achieve these same goals, work together, but maybe make it so that we can spend less money? There isn't a lot of time spent on that. I mean, there's a lot of time spent on, what the curb number should be, and, how much abstraction amount should there be, and all of these different nuances. And so the white paper came about as a way for us to collaborate. So we brought together 11 developers and 11 cities, and I know we didn't have watersheds at that group, but to just where could we agree? Because the legislature hasn't been doing a very good job. We've had 3 or 4 terms now where we keep thinking there's going to be something passed to help housing, but it never really gets passed because the housing first sits over here with the developers, and League of Minnesota Cities sits over here with the cities, and we don't really do a great job of collaboration. So our intent was to collaborate and bring cities and developers together in a room and lock the doors and sit there until we could figure out a few items to make recommendations. We're not holding them up as the best recommendations you've ever seen, but we're holding them up as, here are 16 items that we could agree on that are going to start moving toward less regulation in a way that both cities and developers could accept. And maybe it's a way of figuring out how to work together, and it could start a trend. So I'm sorry. I know I was trying to keep it, yeah. and so I think I'll stop with that. I mean, and so that's so the white paper, the idea was for watersheds in particular was that there's multiple layers of regulation. In many cities, you have to follow the city regulation and the watershed. There isn't. So you have to follow both, and they sometimes conflict. They're not always the same. Sometimes their approval processes are different. Sometimes the timelines are different. There's certain municipalities and watersheds where the watershed won't review your plan until you have a pre-plat approved, which is sort of backwards, right? I mean, it's exactly what you guys are trying to avoid, actually. And so the idea was just we would give cities the ability to decide, because the cities still could decide to have watersheds do that's how it's written. The cities could still decide to use watersheds as their regulatory arm, or they could take over that authority, but it is up to the cities to make that choice. And why it's important is the vast majority of this stormwater infrastructure is actually maintained by the cities. There are areas where there's private maintenance because it gets pushed onto the landowners, which is a whole nother topic. But in the vast majority of cities, the stormwater ponds, the stormwater infrastructure is their maintenance responsibility, is not the responsibility of the watershed. So the watershed is requiring it, but they're not ever actually maintaining it. And so I guess just feel how if somebody, was doing that to you in your own life. Like figuring out the rules for you, but then not actually paying for you to maintain them. So I'll stop there, sorry.
That's good. Thank you, Paul. Thank you all panelists for providing your perspective. We won't ask for Lewis's. He gave the keynote and kind of set the stage. So we're going to dive into questions. We can take a question for the room if somebody's ready to chime in. Otherwise, I do know there's some online. All right, let's take an online question.
With the petition to the EPA about water quality in southeast Minnesota, do you think watershed districts would help the situation, or is the one watershed, one plan and SWCD power sufficient?
Anybody can dive in.
I think that's a good one for Lewis.
Could you just repeat the very first part of the question? I didn't hear it.
Yes. With the petition to the EPA about water quality in southeast Minnesota, do you think watershed districts would help the situation?
Yes. So one of the things I'm aware of is the group, the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, has petitioned for the Pollution Control Agency to adopt rules to regulate agricultural drainage. And that might be part of what this question is going to, because a big focus of concern is the Minnesota River Basin. And I would say that we have a history of a lot of water quality problems in the Minnesota River that we haven't found a solution for yet. So the idea that imposing watershed districts on the counties along the Minnesota River Basin, I don't think from the outside is the way to go. But I would hope that over time, people can look at all the watersheds draining into the Minnesota River and all of the innovative practices that drainage authorities and watersheds are all working on to deal with the water quality problems, that it might be a good way to go. The model that we often talk about is the Red River Basin, where we have, back in the 1970s, it was largely flooding problems that motivated the communities in the Red River Valley to organize, take their watershed districts and organize a collective basin organization and give it taxing authority to tax all the property in the Red River Basin with the member watersheds, keeping half of that and half going to the whole basin. And that has led to a history of really significant work to deal with flooding problems, not total solutions. But key things are the communities wanted to organize that way. They got their act together and then got to the legislature and said, we want to tax ourselves. And that leveraged a lot of state and some federal money that has led to much more investment to solve the water problems. We have a long conversation that has been occurring in the Minnesota River Basin, and it needs to continue because the water quality problems, the last time I checked, Lake Pepin is still full of a lot of sediment. So, and the Minnesota River is a naturally erosive environment to start with. So sediment, has been there, but the installation of drainage over time probably has accelerated that problem, exacerbated a bit. And so communities in the Minnesota River need to get together. And I would say a watershed district basin approach is a good guide, but it needs to be a locally led initiative.
Other thoughts on that? One watershed, one plan, SWCD, anything like that? All right, do we have a question in the audience for our panel? Otherwise, we have more online. Oh, all right. Thank you, Chris.
Since you all are such great friends and you have had history together, talk about their successes along the way. Talk about the strategies you each implemented to get to a successful endpoint and how you leverage that to the next opportunity or project going forward.
I can go.
Yeah, go first. I'll chime in.
And I'll try to go from the positive angle, not the negative angle, but the City of Victoria and Minnehaha Creek Watershed District had a number of years of struggle where we weren't in agreement on what should happen. And so what that looked like in reality was city staff attending every watershed district board meeting to make sure that they could see us and knew what we were thinking, and our city council members going to county commissioners, and all of this political drama. And it was not a great use of resources and wasn't a lot of fun. But the city went through an election and we had a new mayor, and she really believed in collaboration, and her message to staff was, we're not going to keep fighting with these agencies that we work with. We need to be collaborative and partnerships. And so my reference to, one of my responsibilities being to follow council policy and goals, the council was saying to staff, look, figure out how to work together, figure out how you can make things better. And James can speak to his perspective at that time, but he shared that mindset. So we started to shift our approach and started to work together and look for little opportunities. And we've been able to build a lot of success over time through collaboration and partnership, where we've been able to leverage watershed district dollars for the city to create some water quality improvements and some really great outcomes from working from there. And maybe I'll look to you to see if you want to add to that at all.
Well, I want to give Paul some time to write down some positive stories.
That's why I'm only on one page.
He's not going to work his way through this notepad. I would start by just reflecting on some of the things that Paul said and say we hear those concerns often. It's been a lived experience, and I would just validate Paul in that it's a real experience. There's a lot of complexity in the land use process. You got to coordinate across all these different systems and agencies, and they're all working at different scales, from local to regional to state. And we experience those challenges too. We build projects. We have to get permits. Permits are hard to get. And so we hear that. And I appreciate the Sensible Land Use Coalition's focus on clarity and eliminating black box in regulatory processes and cost and efficiencies. I think those are really important conversations to have, and we'd welcome being at the table. We weren't invited, but we'd welcome the conversation. I think one of the things that I'd say is the challenges are structural, and again, they're baked into the pie from the beginning. City and watershed systems are inherently different, working on different things, working at different scales. They have different languages, different norms, different bureaucracies and rules and processes, trying to get a city and a watershed to speak the same language and operate on the same planning cycles and do that dance together requires people. These systems are legislated, but I think it's really hard to legislate and write policy to force coordination and cooperation. So Cara kind of got it right, is there's people that have come into the city and been change agents. We've tried to recognize that we're not always getting it right and be the change that we want to see, I suppose, in the world. And a few examples that we've seen, and Cara and I have collaborated on this, is it really is systemic, even beyond a development site scale. When development's coming in, the wheels are in motion 15 years before Paul shows up. There's a comprehensive plan that guides how the city is going to lay out land use. And in that plan, cities are required to think about water, and I think they do a pretty good job, but it's water and natural features. Here's the wetlands, here's the lakes, here's the bluffs. Let's not touch those. Here's where we have to meet cities' density requirements. One of the things that Cara and I have talked about is at that comprehensive planning level, no one's thinking about, well, where the wetland buffers go, where's the regulatory stormwater go, which wetlands are going to be impacted if roads are stubbed out in these locations. So the last plan that we did with the city of Victoria, we actually brought money to the table. It was probably a leading question from our plant in the audience from Chris, but you were there too. And we did many, many iterations weaving in the regulatory requirements at that level. And what we found is we could achieve an efficiency in lane miles, configure the units differently, get regional stormwater that created economy of scale for the city that has to own those long term. I think the devil's in the details in terms of how, when a developer shows up on one parcel, those get implemented. But those are some really high-level examples of how I think you can bring the two systems together. We've got project-specific examples, but I want to see if Paul's got any learnings from your experience on, what it's like to cooperate and collaborate.
I think I can go back to that positive space. And I would just say, I wasn't sure if you had a rebuttal there at first, but, but I would say that let's just go to Locust Hills. Locust Hills was a very difficult piece on Lake Minnetonka, very high profile property. We came across wanting to do a PUD using a unique approach to try to make smaller home sites in that particular municipality, to save some of the open space and provide a kind of a balance. And through that, we needed some flexibility to certain regulations. I think wetland buffers was still, wetland buffer, flexible wetland buffers was still actually a relatively new concept. I think we worked it out and we came up with a flexible buffer. And we made there were some other concessions that the Watershed made to make it work. And in turn, we included all kinds of demonstration projects with that. We did a stormwater pond with a filtration ring for infiltration. We did a porous paved cul-de-sac. We did a porous paved parking lot. And we did all these different, different examples of how you could treat stormwater. And it was a very collaborative approach. We worked together and it worked out, I think, pretty well. And it was a pretty successful project. I think that the recession happened, and since then we actually still haven't recovered. and I'll just tell you from a developer's standpoint and from my performance, don't have the same flexibility they used to. The land costs, the additional regulation that has happened has taken away most of our ability to try to throw some of that extra stuff in. I'll say the other thing that I've been advocating for, it didn't achieve consensus at the white paper, but it was the idea that pretty much every project be a PUD. Because I just think land isn't a square box everywhere. And I believe that it's a lot better if and I used to talk about this with Eric Evenson quite a bit, the idea of an environmental PUD, because in some cases, it doesn't make sense to tear down a bunch of trees to put in a pond. And in other circumstances, there might be different resources that we want to protect. And so it seems like there should be a PUD approach, not just for the development, but also for the ecological portions of the site. And we just don't look at it that way quite yet.
Right.
Can you explain PUD for those that might not know?
Planned unit development. Okay. So it's basically an approach that allows you to sort of throw out the zoning code and sort of make up your own rules for the size of lot, the types of homes you can put on there.
And I think creativity, when you get down to an individual project and site scale, is tough because we go through these orderly processes to adopt thoughtful regulations to minimize the harm of development, and then we hand those off to people that have to follow those dutifully. And there's a real balancing act in being creative in a planned unit development kind of blank canvas scenario and mitigating precedent and risk of constantly changing public policy and applying that willy-nilly. So people are trapped in systems. But I would say, exercising creativity on tight timelines with slim budgets at the end of development process is sort of the biggest hang up. And even when folks are coming to the table early, it's a challenge. I think Lewis spoke to a few examples that I'd point out of us getting it right. And the question is, how do you build a system around the positive stories? I think we spend a lot of time thinking about what's broken. We should equally study all the case studies that really worked and try and write systems around that. So at West End, which Lewis mentioned, it's 10394. We ended up getting in, it was a bit fluke, but early on a 35-acre, $300 million redevelopment of a medtech warehouse. And by bringing regulatory certainty, technical assistance, cash, and making the process efficient, we were able to get extra stormwater integrated into that once-in-a-generation project that reduced loading like 47 pounds. It stored 62 acre-feet of water in that development, and it delisted Brownie Lake. In a more greenfield type development, farm field, we worked with this a family trust, and we were really thinking about what their goals are, and they were trying to preserve the heritage of the land that their family had homesteaded while also monetizing it and capturing some value by developing. So in that instance, we got really creative and we partnered with the city of Minnehaha, actually drew up the family's preliminary plat. We figured out where the road would be, where the houses would be, and that resulted in a 45-acre wetland restoration that became a wetland bank and boosted their pro forma 7 figures. And so we got something that the watershed would have never gotten out of that project if we'd have just issued a permit. And the family ended up making out pretty well economically, and it was a conservation subdivision that met some of the city's goals for planning and density.
Is this where I give the negative examples?
Sure.
No, I have one more positive. I do want to just share another example that's like a cross between greenfield development and redevelopment. So with the city of Victoria, our downtown, if you haven't had the opportunity to go, you should. It's beautiful, it's wonderful. But back in 2003, when the city was starting to redevelop, we worked with the Watershed District and created a regional stormwater management plan for the downtown area, so that as redevelopment occurred, property owners could sell their property, they could tear down the building, build a new whatever, restaurant, grocery store, you name it, and have their regulatory requirements met by this system that we constructed. And we built it, the city paid for it. We used tax increment financing bonds to help pay for that public infrastructure for then the redevelopers to access when it came in. Well, redevelopment of a downtown area happens slowly over time. It's a 20-year process. And during that window, the Watershed District decided to change their rules.
Weren't you both on the advisory committee? Why didn't you could have stopped us.
But the great part is that the Watershed District, because we've been developing our partnership and relationship, they came to us and said, hey, let's figure out a way to help you adapt the system that's already been built to meet the new rules. So they brought technical resources to the table, created different feasibility options for the city to take a look at to implement. And then the Watershed District helped the city find funding in order to implement that. The Watershed District has way more expertise on water grants than the little city of Victoria wants to have. So the Watershed District helped apply for grants, brought that money to the table. The city implemented the project collaboratively with the district, and we've been able to continue to see redevelopment of the downtown through that same philosophy that we had put in place back from 2003. And to me, that's, the regulation is important, but we figured out a way to work together and use outside funding to help the developers be able to move forward with what really the landowners want to see happen with their landowner rights, and then the council's goals for redevelopment. So it wasn't a huge project, but it really, I think, does a good job of highlighting all of those different pieces coming together.
Any other thoughts on that one?
I mean, I can keep going for a long time. I mean, maybe another one, maybe if it doesn't come up later, I'll.
Okay. I know we have a bunch of questions online. We'll take one online and we'll come back in the room.
Newly elected officials at the local city, county, and state levels often do not have as much background in water issues and are surprised at how much there is to know about water governance. Is there ongoing outreach to new folks in those positions?
I can take that one, I suppose, and maybe Cara can chime in because we've both lived through a number of different councils. We have to do that at Minnehaha Creek Watershed at scale. So we have 29 different cities, and I think it's a really excellent question because as we just talked about, we're all operating under policy umbrellas in well-established systems, but people make the world go round. So as new council members come in or new community development staff, it's absolutely imperative that you get to the table and you're having conversations So the new folks at the table and the decision makers can pick up hopefully seamlessly where the last group left off. And that's not always the case because they're running on an election, they have a platform, and maybe they have a different agenda and platform than the last council. So Watershed District has thinks of the councils and the decision makers and staff leadership at a municipal level really as relationship infrastructure to get work done. And so we do closely monitor local elections and who's currently employed and how people are moving around. And we make it a matter of business to get to the table very early in, say, for example, a new council member's tenure and sit down with them and explain the philosophy of cooperation, why we're here, the resources that we have available, the work that we've done in that community in the past, and the goals that we'd like to accomplish together in the future.
Yeah, I would just echo that at least from the City of Victoria's perspective, because this is such an important issue, collectively, we make sure that we're continuing to share that message as staff turns over and new councils come forward. So typically we'll use council workshops where we have water-related issues on the agenda, whether it's talking to the council about the stormwater maintenance program or city permits that the city has to apply for or operate under. We do use those opportunities to educate new elected officials that come on board. It's really important on all issues, but certainly with the complexity and the spaghetti graphic that Lewis showed, it's an important issue to make sure that they have some level of background on.
I was just going to pitch in that I would submit that very few watershed district members and people who run watersheds, I mean the councils or whatever we call it, the commissioners, the boards, are probably in the same boat as a lot of councils where there's so much complexity to the regulation that it really obfuscates what's going on. I don't think there's a lot of engineers that don't get it. I mean, the different modeling, the PA model, the MIDS model, the different curve numbers, abstraction rates. I mean, you can lose people in a real hurry on this. And I know you can talk all of the nice goals and the big picture we want to preserve. All that really makes sense. But when you get down to the actual nitty-gritty level, I think a lot of people don't really understand it. And that was one of the things in our white paper about engineering standards in general, is it's just really a sneaky place for a lot of costs that really add up. And it would be a place where we could spend some time trying to find a way to see how we can improve that situation and make it a little easier and then maybe obfuscate it a little less.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, it's just to piggyback, maybe it's a slightly different direction on the question, but on what Paul was saying, I think that there is a lot of shared work to be done. I agree, and common ground in how standards generally are consistent across the metro. I think that there's room for streamlining so that as developers are moving between watersheds and communities, there's clarity, consistency, safe harbor. I'm not sure how feasible that is. Cara mentioned local control. Cities like local control. So things are going to differ from community to community, whether it's water regulation or city regulation. But I think streamlining there makes a lot of sense. And Paul had mentioned, the engineering world and the sneaky little pieces. The devil is always in the details. And I think developers oftentimes are looking at the land, the massing, working through vision with council, dealing with communities on community engagement, talking to banks, lenders, private equity firms, trying to raise capital. They got a big job to do. So they outsource the engineering. I don't think Paul's running the model. I hope you're not running the models. Maybe that's why you couldn't get a permit. But the engineers, not all engineers are created equal either. They're people operating in a system, and we work with hundreds of consulting engineers. I'll tell you, they run a spectrum. And so now, we rarely discuss the inefficiencies in timing, coordination, and private sector processes. I like to see the watershed. I think the watershed's pretty entrepreneurial, and we like to get people to the finish line as fast and as cheap as possible. And oftentimes, private sector is held up as a bastion of speed and efficiency. That's not, I think, a universal experience. There's inefficiencies in the private sector just like everywhere else. And so there's tension there too. Consultants generally aren't getting paid a flat fee to get you to a permit. They're getting paid hourly. So the more hours they're working on a project, the more fee you generate. So as you break down these systems and you really get to root principles first, I think there is common ground and ways to get efficiency, but it's not just all about consolidation and obfuscation.
You're kind of proving my point because we pay for the review, so the tick adds up. You have consulting engineers as well, right? I mean, you don't have a staff engineer.
Right.
So we both hire consulting engineers.
Yep.
I thought, yeah.
Hi, Paula from PCA. So it's not surprising I'm going to ask about permits. But it just kind of strikes me, at least where not every municipality is regulated through the MS4 permit, but those MS4 permits do kind of, they impose a water stewardship responsibility that maybe wasn't a legal, I could be wrong about that, burden on some of the, I shouldn't say burden either, responsibility that was part of regulations prior to those permits. And it also presents some opportunities for watershed districts and MS4s to partner on outreach and that sort of thing. So I just wonder if you can kind of talk to whether or not the MS4 permit, phase 2 permitting has kind of helped people to talk across borders. I know, shout out to Justine Dauphiné, as I often do in Coon Creek. I know she's very active in working with their MS4s and assisting with some of that, the MS4 reporting and things like that, that they appreciate.
Well, I'm going to stick with positive. I'm feeling very positive today. So, and I can't believe I'm about to say this, but yes, the MS4 permit I do think has had value because it, back to the question about educating elected officials, it creates an obligation for staff to educate elected officials. We have to have an annual meeting. We have to provide that information to the public. But really part of the target when we're doing those things is the council, who's representative of the public. So I think it's been helpful in raising the dialogue. But the other way that I see an opportunity for it to be helpful is to the extent there's an opportunity to standardize regulations. You look at some communities who have 3 different watershed districts, so they have 3 different sets of regulations. Then they have the MS4 permit and the NPDES construction permit. These things historically have not matched. So as a consultant coming in to do what you described, you have to figure out all of these different entities' rules. And then depending on the city, they do have their own set of rules. It's a lot of noise that I do think that if, the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District revised their rules to be consistent with the MS4 permit, which I found helpful for the city. So I see some positivity. When it first came out, it was just another unfunded mandate that we weren't happy about, but
Yeah.
we're working through it.
Yeah, we saw that as an opportunity, and some of this does speak to what Paul's been saying too, is when that came out as a broader blanket, it's forcing a conversation about, the community education and outreach and who's providing those services, so there's not duplication. Cara spoke to how the councils are educated, but we saw that as an opportunity to step back from our rules and say, well, if cities have obligations and they can have local control, at what level should we regulate and how do we align and streamline our regulations with the state and try to create efficiencies? Because there is overlap and redundancy, and navigating that, whether it's for the communities developer or the watershed, is time consuming, and that is resources all around. So I thought that was not without its imperfections, but a push towards more unification.
I was just going to say, when it came out, there was an initial moment there where I felt like cities sort of felt like developers. And and there's another example in there too, where that's where the tension lies between watershed districts and cities, because again, they have to feel like a developer. They're going in trying to get approvals and permits, and they don't like it. It doesn't really sit with them very well. And it's the one moment, and so I do think that's a lesson, because there is a moment in there where if we don't feel good about how we're trying to transact business with each other, we should try to figure out a better way.
Any other thoughts?
I might just take a moment to use the question as a springboard to comment on what I would say is kind of best practice now in watershed rulemaking. And to me, it has to involve a couple of ingredients. One is a really sharp awareness of how municipalities within the watershed are already regulating stormwater or other water resource issues. And looking for where there is overlap and where there is difference, and being able to rationalize the difference. If a watershed district is going to go a different way, you need to have really good reasons why you're going to do that. Now, there might be, I think reasons why established wide, statewide or metro-wide standards, whether it's through MS4 or others, are not always the best standards to apply to your local watershed situation. If you have a trout stream, if you have a watershed with really steep slopes and bluffs and a lot of vulnerable erosion, you're going to want to tailor your regulation to focus on those specific problems. But you need to be really sharp about why you're trying to deal with that problem and imposing what will be viewed as a special burden. And the key there then is, what is the process you've gone through to get to those standards, and who's been at the table, who has been heard. And so typically there will be, all of the communities will have representatives in that process. And I would say it's pretty rare in this modern age for a watershed district to adopt a rule that cities don't support. Secondly, not every builder that's going to come to you for a permit is going to be willing and able to commit to the rulemaking process, but they have organizations that are a part of the dialogue, and they should be at the table along with others who are just concerned about resource protection. So the higher quality of outreach process you do, and the more thought you give to where you are imposing special burdens or unusual burdens, why you are doing so, I would say is really critical in this day and age, because there's a cost element to all of that.
Anyone like to add?
Let's take another online question.
What ideas do you have to simplify permitting and make it more affordable without eliminating the role of watershed districts?
I think that one's for you.
Say it again. I was writing a note, sorry.
What ideas do you have to simplify permitting and make it more affordable without eliminating the role of watershed districts?
There's just, again, when we go to the complexity of this, and I wanted to maybe talk openly a little bit about, some of the things when you get into trying to establish a rule, not every watershed's the same, right? Everybody comes up with a little bit different nuance, a different way of regulating it. And it's a double-edged sword to ask for standardization, because then we end up with the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, which really never had a public hearing, never really got publicly vetted. It's what now has become the gold standard of stormwater regulation. And I'll just throw out an example. Minnehaha Creek, for example, requires you to model pre-settlement condition as the existing. So if you have a farm field, you're still modeling it as pre-settlement. So you're already at a deficit before you even start, because now I'm treating water that's not even there, okay? And so I think if we could agree to all start with what the earth has on the site at the time you start your development, that would be helpful. And same with the amount of pH, when we're talking about treating for phosphorus. That farm field had phosphorus dumped on it year after year after year after year. You get zero credit for that. There's no phosphorus credit for the reduction in phosphorus you're doing when you transform that land into a residential development with grass and no longer any phosphorus. So that's kind of a sneaky way for me to get in a dig. But I do think that if we could come up with reasonable standards where we can agree to treat water similarly, I think that would be helpful. I'm not here really totally against watersheds, because I do think there is a role for watersheds like I said, right away, because I do think water flows over multiple municipalities, and it does make sense to have some regulation that flows over these different areas, because eventually you'll have downstream impacts and they're just going to be a problem. So I'm not really advocating for a complete divorce, but I would, that's what I'm going to throw out, is just my first thought.
Cara, what's the silver bullet?
I
I'm
feel
struggling to find it.
hilariously between these.
Am I Rush Limbauing? Sorry.
I appreciate the question, because at the end of the day, the affordability issue is an actual real issue. I think we need to figure out how to, and this is from my perspective, so maybe I need to figure out how to better understand what the impact of the regulation is on a particular development, and how would it in reality be different if the regulation changed. Are we talking about reducing, infrastructure costs to the lot by 10%, 20%, 50%? I think looking for an opportunity to do some actual case studies of how a particular development might look differently. It's like, some sort of collaborative effort between a city and a developer and a watershed district to take a look at what that might look like, so we can better focus on where we could actually move the needle. Stormwater isn't the only regulation. It isn't the only requirement. We need infrastructure to serve the people who are moving into these houses, and we need that infrastructure to last for 50 years. We don't want to build something that 10 years down the road, you all have to pay to rebuild with special assessments that everybody loves me when I show up with those. So, we're balancing all of those different things as a city. So really trying to figure out from a regulatory perspective what would move the needle, I think would be a worthwhile exercise.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think ironically the solution to the figuring out how to make things work better is just more cooperation between the three different sectors. The Sensible Land Use Coalition position around complexity is true. Stormwater and how to manage it is a technical exercise, and so it's always going to be complex. I think the argument for consolidation is a solution. The question is, does it yield any benefit with regards to housing prices if that's your end goal? And I would argue that I'm not against consolidation. If it solves a problem and you still get water quality and it's simpler and cheaper, great. But if it's complex and inherently complex, I'm not clear on how consolidating it from one government to the other automatically eliminates the complexity and the challenges. And I think the real work is in opening up the books and understanding, which there are studies of, but understanding the true cut, if it's an affordability issue or, as Paul said, an attainability issue, what's driving the cost of housing. What we're talking about here today around cooperation and collaboration are soft costs. There's still hard costs with infrastructure in the ground, with the land value. And so you're not going to eliminate soft costs by consolidation or simplification. You still need to put time and energy into getting permits. So the question is, what fraction of the soft costs are you shaving, and how is that a percent of total development costs? And I know from the study itself, there's other factors. It's not just stormwater. It's I think your whole thesis is death by 1,000 cuts,
Yep.
And there's market demands, consumer demands, type of houses they want to live in, lot sizes, availability of land. All of these things add up into the affordability crisis. And I know that stormwater is a bit further down your list in terms of the legislative platform. So I think if we want to address the solution moving forward, really honest collaboration, introspection on the costs, how you can, what the savings would be and what the optimal policy solution is there. That's something that I'd love to work on together.
Yeah, no, and if you remember what I said about the white paper, I mean, it was what we could get cities and developers to agree on, not necessarily always the best or perfect solution. And I think what this other, it's really, the big dollars aren't necessarily in all the process. The big dollars are in the implementation, just like you're saying, that's a hard cost. I'd like to just talk about infiltration for a good 20 minutes or another hour, because like that one is probably number one. After infiltrate, so we're spending hundreds of thousands, maybe, I've got projects where I've spent $500,000 on poo-poo dirt, for the infiltration basins, and have them fail and then have to do it again. Soil amendments, this whole thing about adding more and more soil amendments. I have an 18-lot development. I have to bring in 5,000 yards of compost. All of a sudden now I have $200,000 cost just on 18 lots. Pond liners, though there's, you got to have 10 to the minus 7. Like all of a sudden there's just one type of clay that you can make a pond liner out of, and that's it. It's all of these details. That's another couple $100,000 per basin. And so you add these costs, and you kind of wonder why we're spending so much money and why the housing is so expensive. We keep adding these things. I would say what's happened is there's no partnership anymore. All the risk is on us. There you used to be able to build a NERP pond. You built it exactly the way it was proposed. You're done. Nobody tested it. Nobody went back to the research that started the NERP pond and tried to figure out if NERP ponds are now functioning exactly the way they were supposed to. It was just accepted. And when it comes to infiltration basins, it's all our risk now. And I could go on, because the Woodland Cove project, we did 100 infiltration basins on it, of which 80 of them failed. I'm going to make up the number, I don't know, but a vast majority of those failed. But we had done 150, 200 Philip Dunn infiltration tests all across the site to prove out the soils. And what we learned from that is just that there's just too much risk. There's too much variability in soil that there's just not as much prediction. You can't just do one double ring infiltrometer or even two and then come back and have an actual reading that you can rely on. It's just too much variability, and so we need to figure out a way that there's less fear about failure, and that we don't keep always pushing it onto the developer to fix things that were constructed correctly. It's just that nature didn't agree.
I do have to make one comment relative to risk, because the ultimate risk ends up with the city and the taxpayers. So if we don't make sure that things are constructed correctly and turned over to the city, you all end up paying for it, because we have to go back and rebuild it, we have to maintain it. I could spend 20 minutes talking about my complaints about infiltration basins and filtration basins as well, and the practicality for a public works department to be able to keep up with maintaining all of that infrastructure is going to be a challenge for a different stormwater session.
This sounds like agreement.
Yeah.
All right, well, we are rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to move us into our closing question. What I'm going to do is ask each of our panelists to give their key takeaways. Now, the key takeaway can be a point you want to reemphasize for our audience as a key takeaway. It can also be something that maybe we didn't have a chance to share, but you want to make sure becomes part of the conversation. And I'll go down the line just as we did introductions from James, and we'll finish with Lewis. So James, what is your key takeaways or lessons learned from today's discussion?
Well, I think a couple key takeaways definitely from Lewis's presentation is watershed districts have given the state what many other states around the country don't have, institutions organized around how water actually works. And I think there's real power and value in that. Water doesn't follow city boundaries, election cycles, or development timelines. It's moving across the landscapes at a regional scale. And I think watershed districts are a great special purpose unit of government to manage that timeless reality. And then I think the second thing that I'd leave folks with is, obviously it's complex. Where the rubber meets the road, often there's bumps and friction, and I think the spirit of cooperation and collaboration and the case studies that we've lived bear out that we get the most positive results when watershed districts are being proactive. They're at the table early. They're bringing technical depth, watershed scale thinking, creativity, long-term stewardship. For every negative case story you could hear, I probably have two positive outcomes. So I'm going to leave people with a small ray of hope that I see a future where We're on a crusade for cultural change, and we're going to keep embodying that spirit of cooperation, and we're trying to proselytize and get more and more cities to come our direction and more of our development friends to come that direction too. Because in the middle, we've got sustainable, equitable, profitable watersheds, and I think that there are shared outcomes there that we could keep working towards. So a few thoughts.
That's wonderful, James. Thank you. Cara, from your perspective, what are your key takeaways for today's discussion?
I guess I'm just going to emphasize that this is another problem that needs to be solved, but we have lots of problems that need to be solved. And through life experience, I've learned that those things can only be accomplished through collaboration and dialogue, but it starts with mutual respect and appreciation for each other's conflicting priorities. So they have one perspective that's important, the city has one perspective that's important, and the Watershed District has a different perspective. And I think when you show up and you appreciate and understand that those things are all equally important, that you have a much better opportunity to create dialogue to solve the problems. At the end of the day, it's only through that things can happen, and certainly we all know as a society, as we're getting more polarized, we're doing less of that. So this just is reemphasizing for me the importance of coming together to solve problems.
I 100% agree. I do. And that's why we did the white paper with, we brought 11 cities in the room to hear them, and I would do the same with watershed districts. I would do the same for stormwater regulation, wetland regulation, all of those above. I think they could each use that same process. Unfortunately, just where I sit today with most of my development projects, stormwater treatment is one of probably the most scariest, unpredictable portions of what I do. I can't gauge the cost. I can't gauge success always. I don't even know always what I have to do to get a successful outcome, like an approval. It's not always clear. And it's not, and this is not just, this is in Minnehaha Creek, this is just generally and so I do like the idea of working together to try to come up with things, because I don't think anybody, if they were in my position, would feel comfortable about what we have to do when it comes to stormwater and getting approvals and trying to figure out the costs.
Paul, do you have any other? That's your key takeaways?
Yeah.
I want to make sure. Okay, good.
I mean, yeah. Rules are like taxes, they don't go down.
Louis, you get the final word. What are your key takeaways today?
My key takeaways, I think, are reflective of the whole conversation, which is, first of all, the burden of and the risks involved in managing stormwater are sitting on Paul's desk, because as a state and as communities, we have said it's not going to be hands-off. We're going to pay attention to how development happens. There will be rules about how it's done, and the focus of those rules is going to be to protect the legacy resources that are wrapped up in our identity as Minnesotans. So it's there for a reason. But the second point is, it's incumbent on those who are imposing those obligations to be able to articulate the value and why it's there, and be mindful of the cost, so that we can get to a cost-benefit discussion in dialogue about whether the infiltration basins are really worth it. And are they worth it for every single family home that's being developed, or should it be done more at a more regional scale? And then my last takeaway is the people point, which is we live in a day and age where watershed organizations have an affirmative obligation to reach out into the community and know who the actors are. Who are the new members of the Planning Commission? Who are the city council members? Who are the new city staff? Who are the developers that want to do work in the community? And don't wait for all of those folks to come to you. You will be so much happier and successful if you take on the responsibility to get to know and work with all of them. Thanks.
That's wonderful, Louis. Thank you so much. Well, that will conclude our Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series event for today. I encourage you all to check our website for upcoming stormwater seminars. If you haven't seen past seminars and you're curious, we have a full YouTube channel of all of our recorded seminars. This one will be on there next week. So I encourage you to check those out as well. And I hope to see you at a future Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. With that, please help me thank our keynote speaker, Louis Smith, and our panelists.